Welcome to part 5 of our do-it-yourself garden design video series, showing you how to create your own custom landscape design using the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. In this video, we are finally going to be talking about how to understand your own particular space. So far, if you've been following us through the videos, you're now thinking about your goals for your space, which is great. In addition to thinking about kind of what you want and all of your dreams for the space, which are critical for you to be able to build those out, you're also then going to need to balance that with getting to know and understand your space from the context of thinking about landscape. So maybe you've been at your house for many years, but you're still probably going to be thinking about areas in some slightly new ways as you follow us through this and the next video about assessing your space. You can see here on this slide, this is a picture of the front yard of the landscape where I currently live in Pomona, and we will be using this front yard just as a way to ground all of this information that we're talking about and have a concrete example of how to go through every bit of the site assessment. In this first video of the two about assessing your space, we're mostly going to focus on why assessing your space in a very logical but thorough and systematic way is important. And we'll talk about some of the key considerations of your site assessment in details. And just to give you a preview, this is kind of eventually where this is going to lead. So this is a drawing to scale of my front yard on graph paper on an 11 by 17 sheet of paper, where each one of the squares represents 1 foot by 1 foot in the real world. And on top of that, I have done my site assessment of the most important elements that are going to be relevant for my design. And this is going then to lead right into being able to create a great landscape and planting design on another version of this same scaled plan, which can consistently lead back to or reference my site assessment, making sure that everything in the new design is really going to work well in context of all of the observations I made about my own site. And so this is breaking down that mysterious process of design into a very logical process, which goes from goals to site assessment and then into design. But before we jump into the step-by-step about how to take your measurements, do that drawing on graph paper, and then ultimately do your site assessment, we are going to talk about some of the basic principles of site assessment and why it's important to take the time to do this rather than getting excited about your goals and jumping right into your design. And the ultimate reason why this is super important to not skip over is because, especially when it gets to where to place definitely your social spaces, but even more than that, when it comes time to choose what to plant, it will help guide your choices from all of the hundreds of things maybe you can plant. It's going to help guide you to what's going to work very well for your goals in that situation and what is going to be successful in that area. That is really one of the most important things about the site assessment for a home landscape. I talked to some people who have never had problems growing plants, but I also talk to a lot of people that have had a lot of problems for years and they think they're just bad at growing plants. But when I ask most of those people a few follow-up questions, what I find out is that what they've mostly been doing for years or decades is just buying something that catches their eye in the nursery and coming home and putting it in the ground. And when I ask them, well, do you research each plant and really find out about what it needs in terms of the sun and shade or the care it needs or anything about the soil? Usually the answer is no. I get the plant, I stick it in the ground and hope for the best. And any person who is good at taking care of plants or with landscape knows that you need to learn some basic information about plants in order to make sure that you're putting the right plant into the right place for it to be successful. And then you're going to need to understand a little bit about the site where you're putting those plants to make sure you're matching up all those requirements. And it doesn't need to be rocket science. You don't need to memorize all this information or buy a bunch of books. For those of you who are gardening in Southern California, our Inland Valley Garden Planner website provides all of that key information that you need for the top over 350 plant choices for water-wise gardens in Southern California. So we have the plant information for you in an easy to search and easy to reference website. But we want to focus right now on the concept of putting the right plant in the right place. That is absolutely crucial for you to be successful with your new landscape. And basically, that's just a short way of saying you're going to want to match your plants to the soil and site conditions. And the most important conditions that you're going to be dealing with are right here. Sun and shade, the ultimate size your plant is going to want to get, and whether or not you're going to be designing it into a space and surrounding it with plants that will all accommodate that will allow your plant to grow to its ultimate natural size and have a nice natural shape. And then the drainage or soil type. Size is pretty simple. Basically, one of the reasons why we are going to draw a 2-scale base map on graph paper is so we can plan exactly where to put our new plants in our new design, make sure we are getting the right number of plants, and make sure we are going to be spacing them accordingly so that each plant can reach its ultimate size, and we're not going to be either putting plants too close together to where they'll be growing over each other, shading each other out, or we'll have to get in there and do a lot of pruning and maintenance, kind of butchering the natural form of the plant. So size is very important, but that's very easy for us to understand, and we're going to cover that even more as we go through design examples, and we have that size information for you on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. One thing I will note, though, however, is that for those of us who are gardening in the warm inland areas of Southern California, some of our plants locally, when we plant them in our yards with the inland heat, will get a little bit bigger than sometimes the nursery pots say. So we have done our best on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website to reflect our actual local observations of how large we see the plants get locally in inland Southern California. Now, sun and shade and drainage and soil type are a little bit more mysterious to people, and so we are going to spend time in this video explaining them in more detail so that by the time we get to the next video where I'm walking you through step by step how to do your site assessment, you're going to have a reference to understand exactly what those concepts are and what they mean and the implications of them. And so this is going to be our essential site assessment checklist. You may think of other things to note down on your site assessment, and that's great. But here are the 9 things that pretty much for any project you should really be thinking about and working through this checklist. You don't need to necessarily draw this down when you get your plan in this exact order, but really treat it as a checklist and check off each thing as you go to make sure that you don't forget about any of them. One of the first things that you're going to want to consider is existing plants in your landscape you might decide to keep. You don't need to start with a blank slate to do a landscape renovation project. And in fact, if you have, for example, a nice shade tree, even if it's not a low water use plant, if it's a medium water use plant, maybe you have a big, beautiful magnolia tree that's 50 years old, then I'm not going to encourage you to take that out just to put in a water-wise landscape. A mature tree is something that's valuable. However, maybe you'll decide to keep that medium water use tree, keep a compatible planting area around it with some other medium water use shrubs, and then water that section as a medium water use landscape zone with maybe drip irrigation. So you can do just that zone as a medium water use, and then everything farther away from that tree then becomes a low water use, maybe California native planting. And if you're thinking about California native plants, there's also some low water requiring California native plants that can tolerate being grouped with medium water usages. And we have a lot of that information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. So thinking about existing plants you're going to decide to keep. Then thinking about sun. What are the areas of your site that are full sun, part sun, or shade? Or also a little bit different, what are the north-facing areas directly north of your house or of your garage that are going to be shady much of the year, especially in the winter, but even some in the spring and fall when the sun is a little bit lower in the south side of the sky. But then in summer, when midday the sun is high up overhead, they're going to be in full blasting sun. So there's a great group of plants that do really well in that situation, but those north-facing zones are something a little bit different to consider. And we're going to cover that in more detail on the next slide. You're also going to want to do a few soil drainage tests in your area. The typical suburban house that we see, the soil drainage is going to be pretty much the same over most of the yard, whether it's well-draining soil or slower draining soil. But we do see exceptions. For example, if there was compaction from construction or somewhere where a car used to park on soil. And so also in this video, we will walk you through how to do some basic drainage tests in different areas of your yard and how to interpret those test results, what that means for your site assessment and your eventual planting design. You're also going to want to think about rainwater. Where does that rainwater flow? Where does it pool? Are there any issues? Getting that down on paper on your site assessment will really be a great tool as soon as you start to think about your design and where you might want to put features like dry stream beds or French drains. You're going to want to make sure you understand where any utilities going through your landscape area are. Some of those you might be able to get mapped for you. That is often the case with a gas line, or if you're newer construction and there's buried fiber optic lines, or if there's buried electrical lines in your neighborhood. You always, before starting a project, want to call Dig Alert, which you can do by calling either 811 or request the service at digalert.org for people in Southern California. That is a free service, and someone will come out through Dig Alert and mark any of the relevant utilities. Sometimes a couple of different people will come, and they will respond within 3 working days to come out and do that marking. Some other utilities, especially like your water line, normally the water meter is at the edge of the property, and it's going to be your responsibility, because everything after the water meter heading towards your house is yours, to basically understand where your main water line is. Usually it is a direct line in between your water meter and where you see the exterior water pipe come up and then go into your house in usually the front yard. And so that's a little bit about utilities. A lot of times, all those utilities are going to be deep enough that unless you're digging like a deep dry stream bed or planting a large box tree, you're going to be okay. But sometimes utilities are a little bit shallow, more shallow than they should be. So it's really good to understand and know if you need to be careful or anticipate anything. Definitely have heard stories where someone who I worked with for front yard landscaping design, their neighbor had a landscaper redo the hedge, and as they were digging to put the hedge plants in, the landscaper took out the fiber optic internet to the whole neighborhood. So you want to know ahead of time. The next part of your site assessment is going to be thinking about views. Views are going to be extremely important in thinking about your final planting design and even where you put some of the more people-oriented features in your landscape. And when you're thinking about views, you're going to want to think about views in a few different ways. One of the ways to think about them is views that you want to preserve. For example, if you happen to have a nice view to the north of the mountains, as you're thinking about where you want to put trees in your planting plan, you might want to preserve the view from a certain spot to the mountains in one direction, but maybe a tree somewhere else will be the perfect place where you can get a nice shade canopy, but you'll still leave a little bit of that mountain view. Another way to think about views are views that you would want to block. So if you want to gain some more privacy, whether it's from a next door neighbor that has a second story window that looks directly down into your landscape space, or you want to see less of a neighbor's driveway, or a little bit more shelter from the street, or anything like that, getting those noted down in your drawing as well will help remind you later on that you're going to want to either work with trees or large shrubs to then strategically be able to block some of those views from certain directions. Also start to think about where the important views are going to be from. So some of this will develop over time as you might be thinking about your patio space, for example, in a new design, but some of it might be already set based on your existing site, whether it's from an existing patio space or also thinking about views from inside the house. Views from inside the house out of windows or out of the front door, if you like to leave your front door open with just the screen shut, are very important as well, especially for front yard landscapes. Oftentimes, if you use your backyard as more of the social space, then you might interact for more hours with your front yard landscape, actually just seeing glimpses of it from windows inside the house, because you might only be really interacting with it otherwise as you're walking to the driveway or coming from the driveway home. So thinking specifically about the view from each room that looks out into your garden space, and thinking about how you might want to frame that view from each of those rooms. Do you want to keep the view open? Are you going to want to close off part of that view for a little bit more privacy? So really getting those initial thoughts down. And again, they'll probably change over time as you start thinking through your design a little bit more, but getting down your initial ideas and remembering to consider it as you go is going to be critically important. Next, number 7 are microclimates. Any particular extra hot, cold, for whatever reason, if there's a wet or moist area, maybe it gets a little splash from a water feature that's already existing. Anything like that that's going to cause a little bit different conditions that might affect either the plants that you put there or where you would or would not be likely to put a social space for people. So an example of a common microclimate that you might find in some yards in our hot inland climate here is extra hot microclimates. If, for example, you have a long asphalt or concrete driveway that gets direct western sun in the afternoon, that is going to get super hot, and any landscape immediately adjacent to it is going to get very hot as well. I have in my yard, on my side yard, a hot microclimate that has an asphalt driveway on one side and then the stucco wall of the house on the other side, and a planting bed that in some areas is only a few feet deep. And so plants that go there are really going to need to be able to take hot afternoon conditions in the summer. And it wouldn't be where I put like tender woodland plants necessarily, but where I'm going to put more robust plants that can really soak in all that heat and still do well in those conditions. And then finally, or getting to towards the end, number 8, anything else about your site that you think might end up being relevant to the design. And that could be really varied and just anything you can think of. So one example that I have had sometimes in looking at backyards is if there's an area that's right on the other side of a fence for like where a neighbor's noisy old air conditioning compressor is, where it just makes a lot of noise in the afternoon and maybe even into the early evening in the summer. Maybe something to note down, probably not where you want to put your patio space right on the other side of the fence if you have a large enough yard where you can decide where that's going to be. Just one example. The other factors you might want to consider are going to be potentially completely unique to your site, but you will know what they are. And if there's a way to note them on the plan, if they're relevant to any particular space, you can do that. And then finally, noting any existing irrigation. If there is any chance that you are potentially going to be reusing any part of your irrigation system, even for example, if you're going to be capping off spray irrigation system heads and converting it to drip irrigation, you're going to want to note down everything you can about the at least surface locations of the existing irrigation system, where different sprinkler heads are, where your valves are. That may end up coming in handy with the design, depending on the new irrigation system you are planning on putting in. Can't hurt to have it, so this would be the time to note it down. And I'll show you how I do that. Normally, I will do that a little bit on a separate sheet in order to just kind of provide some more clarity as I'm looking at different things. Also, being on a separate sheet, especially if you do it on tracing paper, it's easy to overlay and see how that's going to interact with the plants in your new design, especially if you are going to modify your spray irrigation system, but keep it as a spray irrigation system. You'll need to think about the plant heights immediately next to those spray heads, and so having those marked down would be a good way to do that. You may very well still need to modify where those spray heads are a little bit, but knowing where things start is going to be very useful in planning for all of that. And so with this basic site assessment checklist explained, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into a couple of the different, more detailed aspects of this. And the two that I get the most questions about in general from people thinking about this the first time are sun. What exactly does full sun, part sun, and shade mean? What are the implications for what you eventually might do with plantings? And then drainage. How do you know if you have good drainage? How do you do the basic drainage test? And so we're going to explore those right now. So this slide is a reference for really just demystifying and laying out plain and simple the different sun and shade factors you might see associated with what plants want. Plants are generally going to be classified as preferring either full or all-day sun, preferring partial sun, or preferring shade. And some plants are flexible, so it's not that rare to come across plants that can either take full sun or partial sun, or sometimes partial sun or shade. There's very few plants that can take all three conditions, but there are a few out there. So full sun or all-day sun doesn't literally need to mean sun directly on the garden area from sunup all the way to sundown. Full sun or all-day sun is defined as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight during most of the year. That's generally what most sun-loving plants are going to be happy with. It can be more than that, but that's really kind of that minimum for full sun or all-day sun. If it's less than 6 or more hours of direct sunlight during most of the year, that's going to be considered partial sun, and many partial sun plants can take that sort of exposure. Partial sun usually includes either areas with direct sunlight in the morning, then maybe shade in the afternoon, or dappled shade in the afternoon or later in the day, or areas that are dappled or partially shaded sunlight throughout most of the day. So think kind of like not a dense, but a high open tree canopy and some partial sunlight underneath, not true shade the whole day. In hot inland areas, plants for areas that are in shade much of the day, but then are in strong hot afternoon sun, are going to be best when they are adapted to both partial sun and full or all-day sun, because that afternoon sunlight is so intense. They need to be able to take that hot, intense sunlight in the afternoon. And so plants that just want partial shade can usually take direct morning sun, but will need some shelter from the hot afternoon sun. So some partial shade plants can take, for example, sun in the morning, but then maybe they're directly on the east side of a house, up against the house, so they're well protected from the hot afternoon shade. A lot of full sun plants will take that condition as well, because they will get more than 6 hours of direct sunlight in the summer. If you do have that shade in the morning and then that hot west afternoon sun in the summer, there's plenty of plants to choose from those ones that are adapted to both full sun and partial sun. And then finally, special consideration for areas directly on the north side of houses or on the north side of garages. And those are going to be a little bit similar to some of those other conditions where they need to take a range of conditions. And the reason why is because during a lot of the year, the sun is actually slightly in the south side of the sky. And in summer, the sun is high overhead at noon, but in the middle of winter, the sun is actually, even at noon, it's the highest it gets, but it's pretty far in the south. And then in the fall and in the spring, it's in between. So directly on the north side of a structure, it's going to be pretty shady a lot of the year, at least for the first number of feet away from the house. And how far out that goes is going to depend on what's to the east and west of the house, how tall the house is. It gets pretty complicated. It's best to anticipate it based on some direct observation of what you see. However, for example, in my mostly north-facing front yard with a single-story house, I'm thinking that this north zone is 5, 6-ish, 7 feet out from the house, where it's shady a good amount of the year, but then comes summer, it's in full blasting heat and sunlight when that sun is high in the sky. And so there are not as many plants for those situations that are that well adapted, but there are plenty to choose from. And so the plants for those areas should generally be adapted both to full sun / all day sun or partial sun. Or you can also really right up against the structure, sometimes select from plants that are adapted to partial sun or shade or just partial sun, and just know that those might get a little more sun than they want, might get a little bit crispy right in the middle of the summer, but most of them will recover after that. For specific examples of some of my favorite plants for inland valley gardens for the north side of the house or garage, check out our online workshop on our YouTube channel about favorite plants for inland valley gardens. And there's a whole section during that workshop recording where I talk specifically about my favorite plants for these northern exposure situations. And finally, for hot inland areas, plants that you read are only adapted to shade or moderate shade often cannot tolerate any direct sunlight after the early morning during summer, or their leaves might be damaged. So, for example, one of my favorite plants for the dense shade underneath oak trees is called Catalina perfume. It's a currant. It's also called evergreen currant, and that's a great tree or a great low shrub ground cover for dense shade. But in our hot inland area conditions, if there is even just like a strong beam of sunlight getting underneath the tree canopy in the hot afternoon sun with where it's positioned, those leaves will burn. So it really does need true shade. If you're closer to the coast, things are a little bit more forgiving, but inland, really, if something just says it needs shade, it pretty much needs shade. So hopefully this has demystified what exactly it means when you read about the sun and shade requirements for plants, and will be a really useful tool as you think about the different sun and shade conditions in your yard, and then eventually start to move into selecting the best plants for your situation. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about is drainage. And I really highly encourage you to conduct one or more simple basic drainage tests in your project area before you start thinking about what plants are going to do well there. Because if you find out that you have slowly draining soil, you're definitely going to want to select plants that are adapted to that. And there are plenty of plants that are adapted to that, but you want to know that. And in some ways, if you have that situation, don't despair, because it might just make your plant selection a little bit easier. Instead of the hundreds of plants you might want to plant, you're going to be slimming those initial choices down just a little bit, but still absolutely plenty to have a wonderful, wonderful garden. So to conduct one or more basic drainage tests, you're going to dig a hole with a shovel, the spade standard full-size shovel, about a foot deep and about a foot wide. Flattish on the bottom, but it doesn't need to be a perfect square or anything like that. Just a 1 foot deep hole. Then what you want to do before you conduct your formal drainage test, you want to make sure that all of the soil around and underneath that hole is very wet. That soil is fully saturated. Because testing the actual drainage characteristics of soil, you're going to be testing, once the soil is already wet, how long does it take for water to drain through that soil? Think like it's been raining for multiple days already and it's going to continue to rain more. What's going to happen? If your soil is very dry, it's going to act differently than if the soil is wet already. Some soils will drain water slower once they're fully saturated. Some soils actually are going to be so dry initially that they're going to repel water and drain water slower when they're dry. And once they're wet, some of our sandier soils will actually drain water better. So you're going to dig that hole. You're going to fill that hole with a hose and let the water absorb. Then, especially if it's very dry and that area hasn't been watered for a long time, or it hasn't rained for a long time, you're going to do it a second time, just to absolutely make sure all of the water around that hole, or all of the soil around that hole, is absolutely saturated. Then finally, you're going to fill it a third time. But this might need to be the next day. That's fine. But once that hole has been filled and drained twice, that soil is saturated, you're going to want to fill that hole with water from your hose a third time. Then start a timer. And what you're going to want to do is measure how many new inches of water have drained at the end of each hour. The easiest way to do that is do it at a time where you're going to be home for a number of hours. Basically, you're going to be home all day if you need to, and you're going to go out and take a measurement every hour. You'll just set a timer on your phone, and every hour you're going to go out and take the measurement. That's going to give you the most accurate and simplest results. And then you'll use those numbers to get an idea of your soil's average infiltration rate in inches per hour. So here's a step-by-step example. So this is a house that is in the West Covina area, has a clayish soil type, and Brandon, our conservation specialist, was thinking about potential plants for a turf removal project for this site. And so he dug the hole, filled up the hole twice with water, and then this is the third time, and we're going to walk you through the measurements. Notice this stick across the top. It's very useful to get accurate measurements, to lay something completely flat, and a stick or a stake or something like that, it could even be like a broom handle or a yardstick, is very useful, because when you're trying to measure how much water has drained, if you don't have something flat and even across the top of the hole to measure to, it's very hard to take consistent measurements. It's very hard to eyeball when exactly the ruler is even with the surrounding soil. And especially once you get down there on your hands and knees to look at it, it gets even more confusing. So this makes measurement very easy. And so here is the log. Basically, it got filled, timer is started. After 1 hour, it's drained 3 inches. Pretty good so far. But this often happens with heavier clay soil. Hour 2, it's a total of 4 inches. So remember, you are recording how many new inches of water have drained out. So the first hour got down to 3 inches. The next hour only got down to 4 inches. So you're going to be recording just 1 inch additional. Hour 3 sped up just a little bit, which can happen. So 1.25 inches. But then hour 4 down to only 3/4 of an inch. And then hour 5 really starting to slow down, just 1/4 of an inch as this soil gets more and more saturated. And then hour 6 sped back up a little bit to 3/4 of an inch. And sometimes that's just the real world. You do see these inconsistencies for whatever reason, whatever the dynamics that are going on in the soil. And that's why it's also useful to dig holes in a few different places, because you'll get a better sense of the average conditions in your yard. But for this one test, then what you want to do is you can add up all of your hours, divide by the total number of measurements you have. So we added all of these up, divided by 6, and got an average infiltration rate over the total test period of 1.16 inches per hour. Okay, great. So what does that mean? So right here is your guide to what this actually means. If you have over 2 inches per hour of soil drainage, congratulations, you have what's considered well-drained soil. In that case, you can grow any of the sort of plant material where you might read requires well-drained soil, or those plants want well-drained soil. 2 inches or more per hour of soil drainage is well-drained soil. And lots of our water-wise, California native, succulents, and Mediterranean plants do want well-drained soil. However, there's plenty of plants, like I said, that don't need really well-drained soil. If your soil drainage is between 1 to 2 inches per hour, that's kind of medium drained soil. You can't quite claim that it's well drained. And in my experience with that 1 to 2 inch per hour soil performance, planting water-wise plant material, what I find is that in some projects in the past where I've planted plant material that wants well-drained soil into soil in that medium range, they've done just fine. However, in other projects, when I've planted them throughout a lot of the year, they'll do just fine. But then I've had situations where there's like a year where there's a lot of water in the winter, and if there's a series of back-to-back storms, some of the plants could suffer and I could lose some. So if you're in that 1 to 2 inches per hour area, if you want to be safe, you can default to mostly selecting of plants that want or that are okay with slowly draining soil. Or you can have some plants that are okay with slowly draining soil and know that you're going to have some, that want well-drained soil. With those, you can kind of mound the soil up just a little bit. So the root crown, the base of the stem, right where the roots start, is a little bit higher than the surrounding soil. So that area will always drain well. And if you take a look at our recorded workshop on installation and establishment for California native and water-wise gardens, I completely walk you through how to plant those plants and that slightly elevated planting, which is always a good practice, even if you're in well-drained soil, but really make sure you do that. Or you can even build some larger mounds or berms to elevate even more those plants that want well-drained soil. If your soil drainage is less than 1 inch per hour, you have slowly draining soil. And you are not going to quickly change the characteristics of that soil. Normally, that means you have clay soil. You might have some compaction issues, but ultimately, at the end of the day, if you have slowly draining soil for whatever reason, you want to work with plants that are either adapted to slowly draining soil, or more commonly, you will see them listed as plants that are adapted or tolerant of clay soil, because clay normally has a characteristic of being somewhat slower draining. You are not going to change your soil type. So don't even think about trying to add sand into your soil and mixing it in to change your soil type. That's really just more of a formula of having tight, more concrete-like soil. You can slowly over time, by applying some compost to the top and eventually working with wood chip mulch over the years, as it breaks down, it can loosen the soil up some and improve drainage, especially if it's more due to compaction rather than a natural clay soil type. But in terms of the implications for your initial planting, all of those processes take a long time, and you're never guaranteed how exactly the dynamics of the soil drainage are going to change as you do that slow work, which might be worth doing. But remember, really set yourself up for success. Plant plants that are adapted to clay soil. And if there are a couple of plants that just require well-drained soil that you really fall in love with and that you want, build some raised mounds with probably some imported soil that you bring in. You can purchase from a local soil yard. And when you do that, normally you can purchase like a sandy loam soil or a sandy soil and use that to build your raised mound. And you can plant those plants where their primary upper root zone will be in that raised mound. That's a way to get around it if you want a few plants and you otherwise have slowly draining soil. For your easiest reference for what plants are adapted to clay soil, on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, on our plant finder, one of the many factors you can click in order for it to return just the plants that meet those requirements are plants for clay soil. So that's going to be a really easy, handy reference to find the plants that are going to work for you if you do have that slower draining soil. And then finally, evaluate your site and think about the plants and features that you want to keep. Your garden doesn't need to be all or nothing with California native or water-wise plants, but if you are going to be keeping your medium or higher water use plants, make sure you're going to match those with plants that can tolerate or are going to thrive in those same conditions. And you can work with drip irrigation to specifically have one zone of those more medium or higher water use plants, and then other zones with your lower water use plants. If you haven't put them onto your base plan already, it's great to put them on your site analysis and eventually back onto your base plan for any of those plants you want to keep. And so all of this is leading up towards our next video, part 6, where we are going to be going further into assessing your space. We've gone through all of the basic concepts. And in our part 6 video, I'm going to be guiding you through drawing your own base map to scale on graph paper. We'll go through all of the measurements you're going to need to take. We're going to go through how to select the right size of graph paper based on your measurements and really walk you through one step at a time so you can have this base drawing, which will be very useful for not only your site assessment, but also in creating your detailed landscape and planting plan later on. So join us in our next video where I'll walk you through every step of the way and teach you everything you need to know to draw out your base plan to scale.